much of the discussion so far at this event has rightly focused on the external and immediate threat to freedom. And there are certainly times when you look around at the world and you feel that the greatest enemy of freedom and the threat to liberty comes from nefarious despotic regimes in Russia, Iran, or China. But what I want to focus on is actually what I think are the greatest threats to liberty, which come from within our societies. So my talk is called The Enemy Within, but it should probably more accurately be called The Enemies Within. And I'm going to put them into three broad categories: economic, technology, and migration. So I'm going to start with the economic threats to freedom. So at the end of the Cold War, the argument for freedom was pretty easy to make. It not only got you pop music and blue jeans, as Katja was talking about yesterday, it got you rich. But with the arrival of the Chinese economic miracle, it started to become clear that freedom and wealth aren't necessarily two sides of an unbreakable bargain. Getting rich didn't prompt China's middle classes to demand political rights, as a lot of people had predicted. And in fact, we even started to regard the awful possibility that dictatorships or that authoritarian societies might be more efficient. If Beijing wants to build a high-speed rail line, it doesn't faff about surveying the newt population or measuring decibels. It just smashes down whatever's in the way and it builds it. And that's key, building stuff. And I have to say that nothing makes me more pessimistic about the future of Western civilization than when I read about the prospect of another lawsuit filed by opponents of Heathrow expansion, or the unacceptable cost of replacing just one of Europe's huge fleet of aging nuclear power plants, or the unfathomable cost per mile of the UK's High Speed 2, which is the world's most expensive infrastructure project. The waste of time and resources, the unfilled demand, and the inefficiency of it is soul-destroying for the future of our prosperity. But if you suggest sweeping all this stuff away, you're told that's not democratic. Everyone needs to have their say. The regulator has to double-check this, and workers have to have their rights, and everyone needs to file their objection and have their day in court, etc. And all of it raises the uncomfortable question of whether democracy in respect for everyone's rights is just too inefficient, ultimately, to sustain the growth that we need. So over the last few decades, central banks and governments have shielded their populations from the effect of this rising tide of regulation and inefficiency in two ways. Firstly, by a sustained period of low interest rates, and secondly, by a long period of globalization. The first has made everyone feel richer by allowing us to borrow to our heart's content. And the second has made us all feel richer by moving large chunks of production offshore to jurisdictions like China that aren't bound by our regulations, our limits on carbon emissions, or our labor or privacy laws. Well, it seems fairly clear that both of these strategies are reaching their limits. The brew of quantitative easing and stimulus spending unleashed in response to COVID merely accelerated the creation of easy money, and combined with the war and the sanctions in response to the war, it's fed through to the mother of all inflation shocks, which we probably haven't even seen all of, we're only at the start of. And central banks may already be too late to avoid the emergence of a wage price spiral that will destroy living standards. Meanwhile, we're realizing that relying on Chinese production for everything, from our telecoms to our nuclear power plants, rather than being cheap and reliable, is actually risky and fragile. Markets may not yet realize it, but the decoupling of the West from China is already underway, and it's not going to be a very nice process. So add into all of this the requirement for net zero carbon emissions in our energy system and the increasing care needs of our aging populations, and you have a recipe for a pretty stark economic decline. So the question is just whether we can use this price shock to adapt and invent our way out of it. And that adaptation is probably going to be quite a painful process with a lot of losers and a lot of threats to political parties and to governments who grasp it. So I'm now going to move on to enemy within number 2, which is demographics. I think I mentioned this as immigration, but I would say more broadly it's demographics. And I've touched on this slightly, which is that one clear threat to the vitality of free economies and the strength of our governments is the huge rising demand placed on public services by aging. So the logical hard-nosed response by an economist to this is to say, well, it's obvious. If your labor force is shrinking, you should just replace it with millions of aspiring young immigrants who want to come to your continent or to your country. But in the typical way of economists, they assume that they replace human beings with numbers and ratios and just assume that they're fully fungible like lumps of coal. But if the migration crisis of 2016 taught us anything, it's that our populations do not see it that way. What they see with mass migration is a reckless social experiment performed on their societies without their consent. And actually, when you zoom out to look at the longer history of the human race, they're not so far off. When you look at genetic records from ancient DNA studies, for example, it's almost unheard of to see what they would call in the jargon a population replacement event within the space of a few centuries. The fastest event of this kind that's shown by the data so far is the 80% replacement of the British population that built Stonehenge over a 200-year period. And when these events do occur, they're probably not very peaceful. In Europe, within a couple of generations, we've gone from non-European immigrants accounting for a very, very low share of the population to comprising about 10 to 20% in different countries. And that's rising because of divergent birth rates. This is a very unusual event in human history, so it's fair to ask, what are the consequences of it? Why does this matter for liberty? Well, if you ask thinkers like Douglas Murray, you'll hear that a large proportion of the people coming to Europe are steeped in cultures that are unconcerned with liberty or opposed to liberty. And he argues that we can't expect our organically evolved political and cultural institutions to maintain this delicate thing called liberty in the face of this kind of change. It's not that hard to find examples to make that case. We've seen a return of campaigns for blasphemy laws. Just this week, a UK cinema chain cancelled the screening of a movie about Mohammed's daughter after protests. There's still a British teacher in hiding after he dared to show his class cartoons of the Prophet Muhammad. And here in Sweden, we have the politically difficult issue of violence by migrant groups in previously safe neighborhoods, which has risen to the top of the agenda. And we also, we have the sporadic trucks wielded as weapons, bombs, knife attacks, and the stationing of armed guards outside synagogues and Jewish supermarkets. But still, others would argue, and they may also be right, that the real enemy to freedom here is not immigrants who come here with ambitions for a better life and actually to benefit from the liberty which has made Europe and the West an attractive place, but actually the paranoid race-based prejudices of the people saying that immigrants are somehow unsusceptible to the appeal of decent, universal Western liberties. And what we should fear is not the way migrants change our society, but the way we will change in response to migration. And it seems to me that both of these arguments have a strong case to make, and that we're currently on autopilot or with a sense of inertia moving into a great state of experiment that we don't know what the result will be for our most treasured values. So I'll now move on to the last great threat from within, and that's the one that comes from technology. The relevant technology in this case being the invention of the internet and digital communications. So this is a change, as has been talked about a lot, as big as the invention of the printing press, which we tend to associate with the arrival of the Reformation and a great liberation of thought from so-called superstitions or religious authority. But the printing press actually also brought other phenomena like a frenzy of witch hunts that gripped Europe in the 15th century after a rather deranged text denouncing the scourge of witches conspiring with the devil effectively went viral for its time across the continent and was one of the first texts to do so. And in 1920s Germany, the arrival of mass literacy prompted a lot of thinkers to say that this would bring about a great democratizing liberation. Walter Benjamin talked about the written word being pitilessly dragged out onto the street and pasted on billboards, stripped of authority, taken out of books and Bibles, and made into a tool for the common man. And he thought this would lead to a great revolution for liberty. Instead, in that case, it facilitated the rise of National Socialism. And the culture wars are a phenomenon that can be mapped onto these sorts of trends. We will probably remember when social media was thought of as this great force for liberty, and fans of Obama, said that it was a shining example of how social media could be used to mobilize support for new ideas and for freedom. And it was credited with the mass uprisings of the Arab Spring. But it didn't take long to see the dark side. Digital witch hunts driving people out of jobs or to self-harm and suicide, propaganda campaigns drawing people to leave their homes and join ISIS, and the dividing of the metaphorical town square into echo chambers who lose the ability to debate with each other or even agree on basic facts. That's not to mention the totalitarian surveillance and control wielded by, regimes across the world, but most particularly China. And even if you discount some of these overtly sinister effects, then few would deny that the corrosive effect of technology addiction and the epidemic of a sense of meaninglessness that comes with it is a threat to our sense of vitality and our sense of belief in our societies. This is maybe the true death of God that Nietzsche was talking about. It's finally arrived in the form of your smartphone, which has detached you from any sense of society or context that you had before. So there you have it. Those are the great enemies within Western society that are the great enemies to liberty. And if I'm honest, I think in the long run they are probably more formidable than the enemies that come from outside our society. But if there is one thing that will give us the strength to overcome them or to defeat them, it is witnessing the bravery of people in Ukraine in the face of Russian missiles and tanks. So in the end, despite this rather bleak picture, overall, I believe that the appeal of liberty will prevail and that I'm optimistic for the future.
Thank you. Strange enough, you're the first speaker to mention climate change during this seminar. Could we add that as a fourth enemy within, because it demands action that might threaten Western values and liberty?
I suppose I would probably put that into the category of sort of the economy and adapting how we live, because fundamentally the threat of climate change, or the threat of adapting to climate change, is a threat to our living standards. And, because we could probably stop it all tomorrow if we just shut down all our power plants and just decided to go and live in the woods. So yes, I would say that is a major threat, but to me it's part of this broader sort of reshuffling of our economies. It's part of this painful adaptation that's going to have winners and losers and costs, which it's not clear democratic governments are able to overcome or to sell to their populations. Mm.
You're saying that you're optimistic that the Ukrainian resistance is inspiring us. In what ways do you think we will see this inspiration?
Well, I think, for one thing, if you take the technology side of things, before the war started, I think there was a great deal of cynicism and pessimism about our discourse in the West and our ability to agree on facts. And you might have expected that with the war breaking out, we would see a kind of an intensification of that, of disinformation and information warfare. And actually outside the West, I think the case is not so strong, and we have seen that. But within free societies, actually, it's proved quite resilient. People broadly do agree on the facts, and they do agree that we're on the right side of the argument, and they support it.
Thank you.